Sarah Mitchell walked through the dimly lit parking garage, her sneakers making soft, echoing sounds against the concrete floor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows between the rows of parked cars. She clutched her gym bag tighter, feeling the familiar weight of her water bottle and workout clothes inside. It was nearly 9 p.m., and the garage was mostly empty, except for a few scattered vehicles. At 32, Sarah looked like any other working professional heading home after a late gym session. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore comfortable workout clothes that didn't reveal anything special about her background. Most people who passed her on the street would never guess that she had spent 6 grueling years as a Navy SEAL, completing missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Sarah had left the military 3 years ago, trading her combat boots for business attire, as she started working as a security consultant for a large corporation. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy. The constant adrenaline, the brotherhood of her unit, the clear mission objectives. All of that was gone now. Instead, she found herself sitting in conference rooms, analyzing threat assessments, and writing reports about potential security risks. But tonight felt different. As she walked toward her car, every instinct she had developed during her military training was telling her something was wrong. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she could feel her heart rate beginning to increase. Years of combat experience had taught her to trust these feelings. She had parked on the 3rd level of the garage, in a spot near the stairwell that she thought would be well lit and safe. Now, as she approached her car, she noticed that 2 of the overhead lights in that section had gone out, leaving the area much darker than it had been when she arrived. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. She began scanning her surroundings more carefully, noting the positions of nearby cars, identifying potential escape routes, and listening for any unusual sounds. The garage was too quiet. During her years in the SEALs, she had learned that silence could be just as dangerous as gunfire. As she reached into her pocket for her car keys, she heard footsteps behind her. They were trying to be quiet, but the concrete floor made it impossible to move completely silently. Sarah didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she used the reflection in her car window to get a look at who was following her. 2 men were approaching from behind, moving with the kind of deliberate casualness that immediately set off alarm bells in her head. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing that helped them blend into the shadows of the parking garage. The way they moved together suggested they had done this before. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to get into her car quickly, but that would require turning her back on the approaching men and fumbling with the keys. She could run toward the stairwell, but she would have to get past them first. Or she could stand her ground and see what they wanted, ready to defend herself if necessary. The training that had been drilled into her during countless hours of preparation took over. Sarah's breathing became controlled and steady. Her muscles relaxed slightly, preparing for whatever action might be necessary. She had faced enemy combatants in Afghanistan and Iraq, survived firefights and dangerous missions that most people couldn't even imagine. 2 criminals in a parking garage, no matter how intimidating they thought they were, didn't compare to what she had already overcome. She turned around slowly, keeping her hands visible and her posture non-threatening, but ready to react instantly if needed. The men were now only about 10 feet away from her, and she could see them more clearly. The first man was probably in his late 20s, with short dark hair and a scar running across his left cheek. The second was older, maybe mid-30s, with a shaved head and tattoos covering his arms. "Evening, lady," the scarred man said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that didn't hide the menace underneath. "Nice night for a walk, isn't it?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued to assess the situation. Both men had their hands in their jacket pockets, which could mean they were carrying weapons. Their body language was aggressive, and they were positioning themselves to block her path to the stairwell. This wasn't a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. These men had targeted her specifically. "I'm just heading to my car," Sarah said calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I don't want any trouble." The older man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "No trouble at all, sweetheart. We just need you to empty your pockets and hand over your purse. Nice and easy, and nobody gets hurt. Sarah's grip tightened on her gym bag. Her purse was inside it, along with her wallet, phone, and car keys. But more importantly, these men had made a serious miscalculation. They had chosen to target someone who had been trained to handle much worse situations than this. I don't think that's going to happen, Sarah replied, her voice taking on a harder edge. The months of combat training, the endless drills, the life-or-death situations she had survived. All of it was coming back to her now. The scarred man's fake smile disappeared. Listen, lady. We're trying to be nice here. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah noticed that they were both reaching deeper into their pockets now, probably for weapons. She had maybe 3 seconds before this situation would escalate from threats to violence. In her mind, she was already planning her response, identifying which man posed the greater threat, and calculating the best way to neutralize both of them. The parking garage suddenly felt much smaller, and Sarah found herself slipping back into the mindset that had kept her alive through 6 years of military service. These weren't just criminals trying to rob her, they were enemy combatants, and she was a Navy SEAL with a mission to complete. The older man took a step closer, his hand now clearly gripping something in his jacket pocket. Last chance, sweetheart. Hand over the purse, or we're going to have to take it from you. Sarah's response was a cold smile that would have been familiar to anyone who had served alongside her in the military. It was the expression of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. Someone who was about to remind these men why Navy SEALs were considered among the most elite warriors in the world. You know what? Sarah said, shifting her weight slightly and adjusting her grip on the gym bag. I think you gentlemen have made a very serious mistake tonight. The scarred man's eyes narrowed at Sarah's response. Mistake? The only mistake here is you thinking you can mouth off to us. He pulled his hand from his jacket pocket, revealing a knife with a 4-inch blade that gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights. His partner followed suit, producing a similar weapon from his own pocket. Should have just handed over the purse when we asked nicely, the older man growled. Taking another step forward, Sarah's expression didn't change, but every muscle in her body was now coiled and ready for action. She had faced armed enemies countless times before, often in situations where the stakes were much higher than a simple robbery. 2 untrained criminals with knives were nothing compared to the Taliban fighters she had encountered in mountain caves or the insurgents who had tried to ambush her convoy in Iraq. The scarred man made the first move, lunging forward with his knife aimed at Sarah's midsection. It was a clumsy, telegraphed attack that gave her plenty of time to react. Sarah dropped her gym bag and sidestepped the thrust, her movement so fluid and quick that the attacker stumbled past her, thrown off balance by his own momentum. As he tried to recover, Sarah's training took over completely. She pivoted on her left foot and drove her right knee upward with devastating force, connecting directly with the man's ribs. The impact was precise and brutal, targeting the floating ribs on his right side. The sound of bone cracking echoed through the parking garage. The scarred man's breath exploded from his lungs in a strangled gasp. The knife fell from his hands as he doubled over, clutching his side and struggling to breathe. Sarah had delivered the strike with the full power of her legs and core, the same technique she had used to disable enemy combatants during close-quarters combat training. The older man stared in shock for a split second, unable to process what had just happened. His partner, who moments ago had been confidently threatening a lone woman, was now on his knees, gasping for air, and possibly dealing with broken ribs. What the hell? He started to say. But Sarah didn't give him time to finish the sentence. She spun toward him, her movements controlled and purposeful. The second attacker tried to slash at her with his knife, but his technique was amateur compared to the trained killers Sarah had faced in combat. She caught his wrist with her left hand, stopping the blade inches from her body, and simultaneously drove her right elbow into his solar plexus. The blow knocked the wind out of him, but Sarah wasn't finished. Using a joint lock she had practiced thousands of times, she twisted his wrist sharply, forcing him to drop the weapon. The knife clattered across the concrete floor, spinning away into the shadows between 2 parked cars. With his arm still trapped in her grip, Sarah stepped behind him and applied a blood choke, her forearm pressing against the carotid arteries in his neck. It was a technique that could render someone unconscious in seconds when applied correctly, and Sarah had the experience to apply it very correctly indeed. The older man struggled frantically, trying to break free from her hold, but Sarah's position was perfect. She had learned these techniques from some of the best instructors in the military, and she had used them in real combat situations where failure meant death. "Sleep tight," she whispered in his ear, as his struggles began to weaken. Within 10 seconds, his body went limp as unconsciousness took hold. Sarah released him and let him drop to the concrete floor. He would wake up in a few minutes with a headache and no permanent damage, but he would be out of the fight for now. She turned her attention back to the first attacker, who was still on his knees, breathing heavily and holding his injured ribs. His face was pale with pain and shock, and he was staring at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. You broke my ribs," he gasped, his voice tight with pain. "Probably just cracked them," Sarah replied, matter-of-factly, picking up her gym bag from where she had dropped it. "You'll live, but you might want to get to a hospital." The scarred man looked around desperately, as if hoping for backup that wasn't coming. His partner was unconscious on the ground, the knives were scattered and out of reach, and the woman they had tried to rob was standing over them looking completely unruffled by the violence that had just occurred. "Who are you?" he whispered, still struggling to catch his breath. Sarah considered the question for a moment. She could tell him about her military service, about the years she had spent training for exactly this kind of situation, about the missions she had completed and the enemies she had defeated. But instead, she simply picked up the knives from the concrete floor and tossed them into a nearby trash bin. "I'm someone you really shouldn't have messed with," she said simply, "and I think you're starting to figure that out." The sound of footsteps echoed through the parking garage, and Sarah turned to see a security guard approaching, drawn by the noise of the confrontation. The guard was an older man, probably close to retirement, and his eyes widened as he took in the scene before him. "Ma'am, is everything all right here?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the radio on his belt. "These two gentlemen tried to rob me," Sarah explained calmly. "I defended myself. You might want to call the police and an ambulance. This one probably needs medical attention for his ribs." The security guard looked down at the unconscious man, then at the injured one still kneeling on the ground, then back at Sarah, who appeared completely unharmed and composed. "You did this? By yourself?" "I had some training," Sarah said with a slight smile. "It came in handy tonight." As the security guard called for backup and medical assistance, Sarah reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated and resolved. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes from start to finish. Her attackers had expected to find an easy target, a lone woman they could intimidate and rob without resistance. Instead, they had encountered someone who had been trained by the United States military to handle much more dangerous situations than a parking garage mugging. Sarah had spent years learning how to stay calm under pressure, how to assess threats quickly, and how to neutralize armed opponents using nothing but her hands and feet. The scarred man was still staring at her with a mixture of pain and amazement. "You're military, aren't you?" he said through gritted teeth. Sarah nodded slightly. "Former Navy SEAL. Special Operations." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Navy SEALs were legendary, even among criminals who thought they knew about violence and intimidation. They were the elite of the elite, warriors who completed impossible missions and survived situations that would break ordinary people. "We didn't know," he said weakly, as if that somehow made the situation better. "No," Sarah agreed. "You didn't know. But that's the thing about making assumptions. Sometimes they come back to bite you." In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard echoing through the parking garage. The police and paramedics would be there soon, and Sarah would have to explain what had happened. She wasn't worried about any legal consequences. The security camera footage would clearly show that she had acted in self-defense against armed attackers. The unconscious man began to stir, groaning softly as consciousness slowly returned. When he opened his eyes and saw Sarah standing nearby, looking down at him with a calm expression, the memory of what had happened came flooding back. "Stay down," Sarah advised him quietly. You've had a rough night, and moving around too much isn't going to help." The man wisely took her advice, remaining flat on his back while he tried to piece together how their simple robbery had gone so catastrophically wrong. His partner was injured and in obvious pain. Police sirens were getting louder by the minute. And the woman they had tried to victimize was standing over them both, completely in control of the situation. The first police car arrived within 5 minutes, followed closely by an ambulance and 2 more patrol vehicles. The parking garage suddenly filled with flashing red and blue lights, casting dancing shadows across the concrete walls and pillars. Detective Maria Rodriguez stepped out of the lead vehicle. A seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience handling violent crimes in the city, she had seen plenty of robbery attempts gone wrong. But something about this scene struck her as unusual. The alleged victim appeared completely calm and uninjured, while the supposed perpetrators looked like they had been hit by a truck. "I'm Detective Rodriguez," she said, approaching Sarah with a professional but friendly demeanor. "Are you the victim here?" Sarah nodded, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "Sarah Mitchell. These 2 men attempted to rob me at knife point. I defended myself." The detective's eyebrows rose slightly as she took in the scene. The paramedics were already examining the injured man, confirming that he had at least 2 cracked ribs and possibly some internal bruising. His partner was sitting up now, but still looked dazed and disoriented from the blood choke. "You defended yourself against 2 armed attackers?" Rodriguez asked, pulling out her notebook. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" As Sarah recounted the events, the detective's expression grew more and more intrigued. The story was clear, consistent, and matched the physical evidence at the scene. The security guard confirmed that he had heard the commotion and arrived to find the situation exactly as Sarah described it. "Ma'am, I have to ask, do you have any martial arts training or military background?" Rodriguez inquired. "The level of control you showed here is pretty remarkable." 6 years in the Navy SEALs, Sarah replied simply. "Special Operations Force." The detective stopped writing and looked up from her notebook. "Navy SEALs? You're a former SEAL?" Sarah reached into her gym bag and pulled out her wallet, showing Rodriguez her military ID and discharge papers. The detective examined them carefully, noting the commendations and service record that painted a picture of an exceptional soldier. "Well, that explains a lot," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "These guys picked the wrong person to mess with tonight." As the paramedics loaded the injured attacker onto a stretcher, he caught Sarah's eye and spoke up weakly. "Look, I'm sorry, all right? We didn't know who you were. We just thought you'd be an easy target." Sarah walked over to the stretcher, her expression serious but not unkind. "Let me give you some advice," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Find a different line of work. There are a lot of people out there who've been through things you can't imagine. Military veterans, police officers, people who've survived violence and learned how to protect themselves. You never know who you're approaching in a dark parking garage." The man nodded weakly, wincing as the movement aggravated his injured ribs. "Yeah, I think I'm done with this kind of thing." His partner, now seated in the back of a patrol car with his hands cuffed behind his back, was telling a similar story to another officer. Both men were facing charges for attempted armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and several other felonies that would likely put them away for years. Detective Rodriguez finished taking Sarah's statement and closed her notebook. "Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that you won't face any charges here. This is about as clear-cut a case of self-defense as I've ever seen. The security cameras captured the whole thing, and it's obvious that you only used as much force as necessary to protect yourself." "I appreciate that," Sarah said. "I never wanted this to happen, but I wasn't going to let them hurt me or take my belongings." "Can I ask you something?" the detective said, lowering her voice slightly. "In all your military experience, did you ever think you'd end up using those skills in a parking garage in downtown Denver?" Sarah smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Honestly, no. When I was serving overseas, I figured any fighting I did back home would be on a training mat in a gym somewhere. I never expected to need combat techniques just trying to get to my car after a workout." As the scene began to wind down and the various emergency vehicles prepared to leave, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered near the entrance to the parking garage. Word was already spreading about what had happened. A former Navy SEAL had single-handedly defeated 2 armed robbers, using nothing but her bare hands. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation as people discussed the incident. Some were amazed, others were skeptical, and a few seemed almost frightened by the idea that someone could be so dangerous while looking so ordinary. "Ma'am," a young police officer approached Sarah as she prepared to finally get into her car. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service. My brother is in the Marines, and hearing stories like this, it means a lot to know that people like you are out there." "Thank you," Sarah replied, touched by the gesture. "Tell your brother to stay safe, and that we're all proud of what he's doing." As the last of the police cars pulled away, leaving Sarah alone in the parking garage with just the security guard, she finally allowed herself to relax. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and she could feel the familiar post-combat fatigue beginning to set in. "Quite a night," the security guard said, shaking his head in amazement. "In 30 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything like that." "Hopefully you won't see anything like it again," Sarah said, unlocking her car door. "Though you might want to recommend getting those lights fixed. Dark areas like this make it too easy for people to set up ambushes." The guard nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make sure to report that first thing tomorrow morning." As Sarah drove home through the quiet city streets, she found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. The years of grueling SEAL training, the dangerous missions overseas, the difficult transition to civilian life. All of it had prepared her for a confrontation she never expected to face. She thought about her former teammates, scattered around the country now, most of them also trying to build new lives away from the military. They would probably get a kick out of this story when she told them about it. 2 criminals with knives against a former SEAL. It wasn't even a fair fight. But Sarah also felt a deeper sense of responsibility. Her training and experience had given her advantages that most people didn't have. She could protect herself in situations where others might become victims. That was both a blessing and a burden, and it reminded her why she had chosen to work in security consulting rather than completely walking away from anything related to protection and defense. When she finally pulled into her driveway, Sarah sat in the car for a few minutes, letting the events of the evening sink in completely. Tomorrow, she would probably have to deal with paperwork, insurance reports, and possibly media attention if word of the story spread. But tonight, she was just grateful to be home safely, knowing that her years of service and sacrifice had served her well when she needed them most. The 2 men who had tried to rob her would have time in prison to think about their choices and hopefully find better paths forward. As for Sarah, she made a mental note to vary her routine a bit more, maybe find a different gym or change her workout schedule, not because she was afraid. Fear was something she had conquered long ago, in much more dangerous places than a parking garage. She simply understood that being prepared meant thinking ahead, staying alert, and never taking safety for granted. It was a lesson that had kept her alive through 6 years of military service, and it would serve her well in whatever came next in her civilian life. The porch light was on, welcoming her home after what had turned out to be a much more eventful evening than she had planned. Sarah grabbed her gym bag, locked the car, and walked to her front door, already looking forward to a hot shower and a good night's sleep. Behind her, the city continued its nightly rhythm, mostly unaware that a parking garage robbery had ended very differently than the criminals had planned, thanks to the training and courage of one former Navy SEAL who had simply been trying to get home after a workout.